Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We will follow three basic principles: to not lie, to not steal, and to not betray the people. Long live Mexico. Long live Mexico.
Andrés Manuel López Obrador wins Mexico's presidential election in a landslide, becoming Mexico's first leftist leader in decades. We'll go to Mexico City for the latest. Then to Washington, where tens of thousands rallied Saturday to protest the Trump administration's separation of migrant children from their parents at the border.
I came here today as an Indigenous woman who has also experienced much of what's been happening at the border, as a former political refugee, as a child who also crossed the border. Because there are many Indigenous children right now in detention centers who can't communicate, and they've been separated from their families, and they have no one to speak for them.
And we'll go back to the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Mexico, leftist politician Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO, has claimed victory after winning Sunday's presidential elections by a landslide, vowing to transform Mexico by reducing corruption and violence.
The new project of the nation will seek to establish an authentic democracy. We don't bet on building an open or closed dictatorship. The changes will be profound, but will happen with a strict adherence to the legal established order. There will be corporate freedom, freedom of expression, of association, and of beliefs. We will guarantee all the individual and social freedoms, as well as the political rights of citizens, consecrated in our Constitution. The transformation will consist of banishing corruption from our country. We won't have a problem in achieving this objective because the people of Mexico are the heir of great civilizations.
Preliminary election results show López Obrador, the former mayor of Mexico City, capturing at least 53% of the vote, more than twice that of his closest rival. The three main rival candidates have already conceded. AMLO's victory comes after the most violent electoral season in modern Mexican history. At least 136 politicians have been assassinated in Mexico since September. A number of journalists have also been killed in the lead-up to Sunday's elections, including reporter Jose Guadalupe Chancip, who was killed Friday night in the southern state of Quintana Roo. On Sunday night, thousands of voters poured into the Zócalo in Mexico City to celebrate López Obrador's victory.
My name is Abelina Fonseca Orozco. Obviously, I voted for Andrés Manuel López Obrador, just as I did 6 years ago when I could first vote. We desire real change. We are sick of the injustice, inequality, corruption, and the impunity that prevails in this country. We want a change, and this change will happen with Obrador, because in his plans for the nation, he proposes many things, such as scholarships, yes, and assassins, no, as well as food sovereignty, recovery in rural areas, and help for migrants. We want to recover this country, and that is why we want López Obrador to be president.
We'll go to Mexico City for more on AMLO's historic election after headlines. Tens of thousands poured into the streets across the United States Saturday for a national day of action protesting President Trump's zero-tolerance immigration crackdown. Organizers say there were up to 700 rallies nationwide, including on the U.S.-Mexico International Bridge in El Paso, Texas. This is Fernando Garcia.
It is in this bridge where many asylum seekers have been turned back and turned away from protection and from petitioning for asylum in this bridge. I think that is not only violating the law, international law, but also national law. The idea that there are families looking for protection and these officers are here telling them to go away. Obviously, there is a common demand, and the common demand is that we cannot treat immigrants as criminals, we cannot put them in jail, and much less incarcerate children the way that the United States is doing.
The rallies came 24 hours after the Trump administration claimed in a court filing it has the right to jail migrant families indefinitely, despite a 1997 court settlement that says the government must release migrant children from detention within 20 days. From coast to coast Saturday, protesters demanded an end to family separation and detention. This is actress and activist Laverne Cox speaking at the rally in Los Angeles.
America, we are here because we believe that families belong together. We are here because our hearts are broken. But let us not forget that this country was built on the backs of slave labor that routinely stripped children from the custody of their parents.
Later in the broadcast, we'll air more voices from Saturday's Families Belong Together rallies protesting President Trump's immigration crackdown and the separation of families. President Trump says he'll announce his Supreme Court nominee July 9th, that's next Monday, and that he's considering 2 women as possible replacements for retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. Both Republican and Democratic opposition is mounting to President Trump's potential nominee. Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins and South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham both say they'll oppose any nominee who's openly hostile to Roe v. Wade. Meanwhile, Democrats are demanding confirmation hearings for Kennedy's replacement be delayed until after the midterm elections. This is New York Democratic congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I would like the Senate to delay. Absolutely. We need to delay until after the midterm elections. That's my personal opinion. And I think that at the very least we need to, if this appointment is going to happen, at the very least we can do is delay the timeline in which women's health care is going to be taken away, delay the timeline in which our civil rights could potentially be further eroded.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was speaking on Meet the Press. Meanwhile, new revelations show the close financial ties between President Trump and Justice Anthony Kennedy's son, Justin Kennedy, who served as the global head of real estate capital markets for Deutsche Bank. The New York Times reports under Justin Kennedy's leadership, Deutsche Bank loaned Donald Trump $1 billion for renovation and construction of buildings in New York and Chicago at a time when many other banks refused to lend to Trump because of his troubled financial history. In Afghanistan, at least 19 people were killed in the eastern city of Jalalabad in a suicide bomb attack targeting a group of Sikhs and Hindus who were waiting to meet Afghan President Ashraf Ghani on Sunday. Among the victims of the attack was Avtar Singh Khalsa, who is the only Sikh candidate running in Afghanistan's upcoming parliamentary elections in October. The bombing came less than 24 hours after another attack in Jalalabad, in which militants beheaded 3 workers at a boys' high school, then set fire to the school's library. No group has claimed responsibility for either attack, though officials have blamed ISIS militants. In Gaza, thousands of Palestinians gathered Saturday for a funeral procession for Yasser Abu al-Najah, a child shot and killed by an Israeli sniper during Friday protests near the separation fence with Israel. Israeli soldiers have killed at least 25 Palestinian children so far this year, 11 of the children shot by Israeli snipers in the head or neck. In total, Israeli soldiers have killed at least 136 Palestinians and wounded over 14,000 more since the Palestinians' nonviolent Great March of Return protests began on March 30th. In Syria, more than 150,000 people have been forced to flee their homes amidst the Syrian government's ongoing offensive in the southwest province of Daraa. The region is one of the last 2 rebel-held territories in Syria. Meanwhile, in more news on Syria, the Pentagon's admitted a U.S. airstrike on the Syrian city of Raqqa last March killed 40 civilians. The bombing struck a school where displaced civilians were taking refuge. A federal judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration from ending the FEMA Emergency Housing Assistance Program for nearly 2,000 Puerto Ricans displaced by Hurricane Maria. The temporary restraining order came after the civil rights group Latino Justice Pearl Deaf sued the administration. In Portland, Oregon, far right-wing demonstrators clashed with anti-fascist protesters Saturday in what the city declared was a riot. The clashes began after the far-right Patriot Prayer Group tried to host a rally in downtown Portland. Anti-fascist protesters then gathered for a counter-rally. At least 4 people were arrested. And Seattle, Washington, has become the first major city in the United States to ban plastic straws, utensils, and other single-use plastic items. The ban is part of a global effort to reduce plastic waste, which is contaminating the oceans and contributing to the global pollution crisis. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Mexico. In a landslide election, voters have chosen Andrés Manuel López Obrador to be Mexico's next president. Celebrations broke out across Mexico City Sunday night. The former mayor of Mexico City, who's known as AMLO, will become Mexico's first leftist president in decades. During a victory speech on Sunday night, he vowed to transform Mexico by reducing corruption and violence.
The new project of the nation will seek to establish an authentic democracy. We don't bet on building an open or closed dictatorship. The changes will be profound, but will happen with a strict adherence to the legal established order. There will be corporate freedom, freedom of expression, of association, and of beliefs. We will guarantee all the individual and social freedoms, as well as the political rights of citizens, consecrated in our Constitution. There will be no need to increase taxes in real terms, not for the country to fall into debt. There will also be no hikes in petrol. I will lower the general cost of living and the public investment to propel productive activities and to create jobs. The objective is to strengthen the internal market, to try to produce what we consume in the country. We won't act in an arbitrary way, and there will be no confiscation or expropriation of property. The transformation will consist in basically banishing corruption from our country. We won't have a problem in achieving this objective because the people of Mexico are the heir of great civilizations.
Preliminary election results show López Obrador captured 53% of the vote, more than twice that of his closest rival. This marked AMLO's third time running for president. In Britain, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn praised López Obrador. Corbyn tweeted, "Today brings a new beginning for Mexico. Congratulations, López Obrador. His election as president with more than 50% of the vote offers the poor and marginalized a genuine voice for the first time in Mexico's modern history. I'm sure AMLO will be a president for all Mexicans," Corbyn tweeted. López Obrador's victory comes after the most violent electoral season in modern Mexican history. At least 136 politicians have been assassinated in Mexico since September. We go now to Mexico City, where we're joined by Christy Thornton. She's an assistant professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Johns Hopkins University. She was an election observer for the Scholars and Citizens Network for Democracy, currently writing a book about Mexican economic history. Professor Thornton, talk about the election, talk about the celebration in the Zócalo, and what AMLO, what this new leftist president-elect right now, has promised.
Yeah, good morning, Amy, from Mexico City. It's really been an incredible atmosphere here. The victory of AMLO and the margin with which he did it really signals a new day here. I think it's beyond the expectations of even some of AMLO's strongest supporters to have seen him win the presidency with what the initial result says is 53% of the vote. We have to think about this was a field of 4 candidates. So for him to have won an absolute majority is something that we haven't seen in recent Mexican elections. And so this is really a very strong victory, a very strong message. And it will be the case not just in the presidency, but in the legislature as well, and in a number of state governorships. AMLO's Morena party, which he founded in 2014, has really become a vital new political force here in Mexico that's really set to shake things up.
So talk about what this represents in terms of Mexico and the United States. Also, President Trump tweeted his congratulations. The corporate media is often now referring to López Obrador as Mexico's Trump. It's not clear exactly why. Maybe they equate being opposed to NAFTA as being Trump.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that the López Obrador's election will have a number of important implications for the United States on trade, as you said, the renegotiations of NAFTA, on security with regard to the drug war, and with regard to migration. I think all three of those things are things in which we can expect a serious change from this Mexican administration, and we'll have to see what the relationship is between Trump and López Obrador. You're right that a number of mainstream media outlets have made this kind of absurd comparison. And I think one of the reasons that has happened is the kind of the worry from establishment politicians and mainstream media outlets about the idea of populism, and the worry about populism where they completely eviscerate the political content of that. And so if you compare Trump and López Obrador, you could say that they are both quote unquote populists, but obviously their political platforms are on completely the opposite sides of the political spectrum. So those kinds of comparisons, I think, are really bunk. López Obrador is really something more like a Bernie Sanders. And what we saw here in Mexico City last night and in Tijuana and in major cities all over Mexico, people commented to me over and over that it felt like 2008. It felt like when Obama won the elections and there was a kind of historic breaking of some precedent, right? And so we have, that seems much more like an obvious comparison, the kind of breaking open of the political system and the hope for real change. Now, obviously, that comparison leads those of us in the United States to worry about what might come next, right? And what can actually be changed. There are real structural impediments. But for now, the power of this movement indicates that Mexicans desperately want that change and are willing to fight for it.
Talk about what AMLO represented, what he promised. Talk about his stand on the wall, on immigration, and on NAFTA, exactly what he's saying.
Yeah, so there are a number of important areas where AMLO has said that he will change policy. With regard to NAFTA, he has kind of moderated his position over the years, but he has said that he wants the negotiations to wait until he assumes the presidency, and that members of his team will now be in the negotiating room. And so he really hopes to now become an important part of the NAFTA negotiations as they go forward. The most important thing for López Obrador on that is the protection of Mexican farmers and the Mexican agricultural sector. Obviously, the United States really protects its agricultural sector in a way that is against a quote-unquote free trade agenda. And that's been devastating for Mexican agriculture. So that's something we can expect to see López Obrador really push against. With regard to migration, he has said that he intends to move Mexico's migration focus to the northern border rather than the southern border, where it's been really at the behest of the U.S. government. So Mexico has really militarized its southern border with Guatemala as part of the larger U.S. policy against immigration, against refugees and asylees and economic migrants. And so López Obrador has said that he wants to reverse that policy, to demilitarize that border, to care for migrants here in Mexico, and to move the center for migration up here to the north, rather than militarizing in the south and really terrorizing migrants as they cross the national territory. So those are two areas in which there could be a real change in policies that affect the United States. With regard to security, he has indicated that he wants to demilitarize the quote-unquote war on drugs and organized crime that was started by Felipe Calderón in 2007, 2008. The military has been sent into the streets with horrific human rights consequences, more than 100,000 people killed, 30,000 disappeared, and those are the conservative numbers. As you said, it's been an incredibly violent year this past year in Mexico. The statistics may indicate that it's the most violent year since they started keeping statistics here in Mexico. So he has indicated that he intends to kind of back the military off of these law enforcement functions. And in your opening clip, a woman mentioned scholarships, not assassins, right? And so that becarios, not sicarios, that was a big part of his platform, that he wants young people to have educational and economic opportunities that won't drive them into the hands of the drug cartels. So it's really a sweeping change in Mexican policy that we can expect to see. And with the majorities in the House of Deputies and the Senate that he seems to have won, according to the exit polls, we can really expect to see some important changes.
Let's go back to Andrés Manuel López Obrador speaking at his victory rally last night in the Zócalo, in the main square in Mexico City.
Vamos a aplicar
We will follow three basic principles: to not lie, to not steal, and to not betray the people. Long live Mexico. Long live Mexico.
So that is AMLO last night. All the major candidates have conceded. Christy Thornton, give us a thumbnail sketch of his rise to power. I mean, back when the Zapatistas rose up in the mid-90s, he was already running.
That's right. So López Obrador was part of a kind of left insurgency from within the PRI. As your listeners and your watchers probably know, Mexico was effectively a one-party state, and the PRI controlled all levels of government, from the federal down to the local, for most of the 20th century. López Obrador was really important in the late 1980s in pushing to democratize from within the PRI. And then when the 1988 elections were stolen fraudulently by the PRI, the computers were literally unplugged and replugged in, and when they came back, they mysteriously showed the pre-candidate winning. He broke off and was part of the new left party that was formed after that, called the Party for the Democratic Revolution. Over the decades since 1988, the Party for the Democratic Revolution has joined the PRI and the right-wing PAN party, the National Action Party, in a kind of consolidation towards the center. So the PRD was run by kind of centrist affiliates with the PRI, people who were willing to go along with the PRI and the PAN agenda. And so we saw after the Ayotzinapa crisis, where those 43 students were disappeared, and we still don't know exactly what happened to them, we saw López Obrador and a number of the founders of the PRI, split off from that party. And so after that moment was when López Obrador formed his new party, Morena. He had run for the presidency in 2006. And that there was massive fraud in that election. He lost by less than half of a percentage point. He ran against the current president, Enrique Peña Nieto, in 2012 and lost by a more sizable margin. One of the things that's been really interesting here as an observer has been to see the extent to which the machine for sort of election fraud, for the buying and coercion of votes, for the kind of corralling of voters to the voting places, it was definitely in action yesterday in the elections, but it was not enough to overcome this kind of tide of support for López Obrador and for his new party, Morena. So this is really an incredible victory, not just for this left candidate and his party, but really for the practice of Mexican democracy. This is really a new day for Mexican democracy, and you'll see people out in the streets celebrating this for some time to come.
Professor Thornton, as we begin to wrap up, you retweeted, I'm not sure people understand just how big an impact AMLO's election has the potential to have on Central American U.S. migration patterns. A Mexican government with no interest in intercepting migrants on U.S.'s behalf? I don't know, man. Talk about that as we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the militarization of the southern border has been done as part of a kind of security cooperation agreement between the United States and Mexico that stems from the beginning of the militarization of the drug war. The Merida Initiative is an initiative that has sent something like $3 billion in training and equipment and military equipment to Mexico. And they have militarized that southern border in such a way that the Mexican government has really been acting as a proxy for the U.S. government in trying to keep Central American migrants out and really terrorize them as they try to cross that border. If López Obrador demilitarizes that southern border, allows migrants to cross Mexico, provides the protection for migrants that he has indicated, it will really change how migration is being handled. And that's something that the Trump administration will certainly confront going forward.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. Christy Thornton, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Latin American Studies at Johns Hopkins University, speaking to us from Mexico City. She was an election observer there for the Scholars and Citizens Network for Democracy, currently writing a book about Mexican economic history. And, of course, we'll have more on this tomorrow on Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now! When we come back, mass protests around the country will bring you some of the voices. Stay with us.
Soy sinaloense hasta el tope. Me gusta decir verdades. cerco como una mula. ¿A dónde vas? Que no te halle. En tu casa no me quieren porque me vivo cantando. Me dicen que soy bandero.
I'm not a gold coin. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Tens of thousands protested across the United States, from hamlets to villages to cities to towns, all Saturday for a Families Belong Together rally to demand the Trump administration comply with a federal judge's ruling all migrant children separated from their parents must be reunited. Last week, federal judge Dana Sabra in San Diego ruled all children under the age of 5 must be reunited with their parents within 14 days, and all children 5 and older must be reunited with their parents within 30 days. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy led to the forcible separation of more than 2,000 children from their parents. The demonstrations come amidst a new strike in the legal battle over immigration. The government said in a court ruling Friday it has the right to hold children in detention with their parents for the duration of their immigration proceedings, which can be indefinitely. Current law prevents children from being held for more than 20 days. Well, Democracy Now! Is on the streets of Washington, D.C., covering the action.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want now? If we don't get it, shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down!
My name is Juanita Cabrera Lopez, and I'm Maya mom, originally from Guatemala, but I'm here in the United States. And I came here today as an indigenous woman who has also experienced much of what's been happening at the border, as a former political refugee, as a child who also crossed the border. Because there are many indigenous children right now in detention centers who can't communicate, and they've been separated from their families, and they have no one to speak for them. What's happening right now with the children and families, all of them, but the ones who are most vulnerable are the ones who can't even speak. The ones because they're too young or because they can't even speak in Spanish, let alone English. And so right now, we as a Maya community that has been displaced from our countries are trying to help our people as best we can by getting indigenous language interpreters to connect with the children. But we are constantly invisible in this struggle because we're mislabeled inaccurately as Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, when we're actually Native American peoples from this continent. I came here when I was a little girl because we were forced from Guatemala during the internal armed conflict, and so we had to flee, or otherwise they would have killed us. But many of the people who are coming here now are the children, the grandchildren of the war, of foreign policies that have decimated our country, of U.S.-backed and military-backed atrocities in my country and in other countries like Honduras and Mexico and El Salvador, Nicaragua, and so many other countries. And so there is a responsibility as well of the United States to not forget its historical role in pushing our people out and in helping our governments violate our rights.
There are calls, of course, to abolish ICE. Your thoughts about that?
I think that is an important step, but I think that there needs to be, that it's not going to solve the problem about everyone who's being forced to migrate in the first place. And so when you're looking at inequalities, structural impunity in our countries related to historical injustices, that's where things need to also be addressed, because people will continue to come whether or not ICE is on the border. And so, yes, abolish ICE, but also look at the root causes of why our people are forced to leave in the first place. No one wants to take that journey of crossing, especially children and girls who are at higher risk of rape. So it's a long problem, and many of us need to come to the table. And what us as indigenous peoples are asking is that our particular rights and need are not ignored, and that we are part of the conversation, and that we can bring our solutions that we're doing from our communities to the table, and that we're not confused and invisibilized by this wrong labeling of being Latino or Hispanic, because we are indigenous, we're Native American nations. My
My name is Maria Teresa Lopez. I'm from Guatemala, from the Maya Nation, Mom. And I was refugees here in the 80s. And I grow my children in this country because the war in the 80s in my country. This is why.
I want to ask you about the 20-year-old Mayan woman, Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez. She was murdered at the border.
1 month ago, the young woman, she's 20 years old. And she wants to come in this country, but crossing the border and was killed. And it's a big, broken heart for me because it's my neighbor village. It's not all. Plus the tension in many places in the border, and so many young women, young men, they speak just the native language.
You came here in the 80s from Guatemala. Can you talk about the conditions that you were fleeing from Guatemala? Talk about what life was like there, and was there and the U.S.'s involvement?
In
1954, when the Eisenhower government performed a coup d'etat against the democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz, and there began the infiltration by the U.S. with the Guatemalan government. This is when I was only 3 years old. Then, during the 60s, every time the situation would become difficult, there was no work for people. There were kidnappings, and no one knew why.
No hay trabajo para la gente. Había secuestros que nadie sabía por qué. In the
70s, the people began to organize to defend themselves because they had stolen lots of land. The army was occupying large parts of the land where Mayan families lived. Then, towards the end of the 70s, the massacre of Ponzos happened because they had found oil in those lands. And that was the first massacre, and that is how it first happened.
De Ponzos, porque habían descubierto petróleo en esas tierras y hubo la primera masacre. Y así empezó.
This is how we lived for 36 years of war that was called the Armed Internal Conflict. During the 80s, when I arrived in this country, I had to tell everyone about the massacres, the forced kidnappings, the poisoning of the water, the policy of scorched earth, in other words, the killing of the people, their animals and their crops. And this is what Rios Montt did.
El plan de tierra arrasada, que quiere decir matar a la gente con los animales, con las siembras. Y esto es lo que hizo Rios Montt. Ya muchos gobiernos llegaron, pero la situación.
Many governments came and went, but the situation of Guatemala only worsened. There were over 200,000 refugees living in Mexico and many more displaced. And we managed to come to this country.
Y muchos desplazados. Entonces, nosotros logramos entrar en este país, pero no quiere decir que olvidé.
But that isn't to say that I forget my mother country or my people. I began to speak out and denounce the injustices that we had lived through.
Empecé a hablar, denunciar las injusticias que nosotros habíamos vivido.
Ferreira. And I am here not only as a brand new mother, as the proud child of Honduran immigrants, and not only as an American who sees it as her duty to be here defending justice. I am here as a human being with a beating heart, who can feel pain, who understands compassion, and who can easily imagine what it must feel like to struggle the way families are struggling right now. It is easy to imagine that I would hope that if it was my family being torn apart, if it was my brother being arbitrarily criminalized, if it was my sister being banned, then someone would stand up for me and my family. It is that simple. This fight does not belong to one group of people, one color of people, one race of people, one gender. It belongs to all of us.
My name is Lisa Fickian. I live in Austin, Texas right now. And I came here to D.C. actually earlier this week to get arrested with over 630 women in the Hart Senate office building to say we need to abolish ICE and end zero tolerance and end these detention camps. I'm here today to be part of this National Day of Action that is happening in over 700 cities and this massive convergence here in Washington. Again, saying families belong together. This is inhumane policies that this government is pursuing across the board. It's been a really devastating week for justice with all these decisions, and this is the kind of resistance that we need.
Were you arrested on Thursday?
I was. Over 630 of us, you know. First we shut down the Department of Justice.
Raise your fist! Women all around! Raise your fist!
Then we took over the atrium at the Hart Senate office building. It was a beautiful, beautiful rising up of women. You know, dropping banners, chanting, "Where are the children?" Taking out the space blankets, being together. You know, we knew that we had to become and model that there is such a thing as a beloved community and that we do care. And I think we did it in just an extraordinary way. I've had women coming up to me today saying my life was changed since Thursday, you know, in tears. Because, you know, when we stand up in solidarity with other people, we're actually healing ourselves as well. And, you know, that was an action of a lot of privileged white women who know deep down inside that they have a role to play. And it's not about being saviors or protectors. It's about actually doing our own healing, accessing our power, making sure there's space for other people, people of color, to make decisions about their own lives and have access to resources they need to do that. And it was a tremendous act of solidarity and love.
My name's Sebi Medina Tayak. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm a member of the Piscataway Indian Nation and the International Indigenous Youth Council. And this demonstration is in our land. The White House is on our land. I was invited to do a land acknowledgement, which means that I was invited to come and say, okay, right now we're on the ancestral homelands of my people, the Piscataway Indian Nation. And when you do a land recognition, it totally changes the conversation because when you recognize the history of the land and you recognize that this is not a white nation, this has never been a white nation, that this land has always had brown people, and that this continent has no natural walls or barriers, then it starts to make you rethink what the foundation of these cruel immigration policies are. It's important to note that most immigrant families are not separated by Donald Trump's zero tolerance policy. That is the most dramatic, cruel, and recent expression of something that's been going on for centuries. But particularly, I want to talk about what's been going on for the past few decades under the Bush, Obama, and Clinton administrations. We didn't talk about incarceration of kids back then. We're talking about it now because of this policy which affected thousands of families, and it's really important that we stand against it. But it's important to recognize that our whole immigration system, whether we have a raging lunatic as a president or a friendly black progressive as a president, are still separating families and killing people.
Sanctuary for all.
My name is Reverend Tracy Blackman, Executive Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. And I stand on behalf of our mothers and fathers and grandparents and ancestors who have carried us time and time again through these iron curtains of white nationalism. I stand as the descendant of enslaved
Jamila. I'm from Houston, Texas, but I live here in D.C. My sign says that I'm a proud daughter of an immigrant from a travel ban country and that you're stuck with me and that I vote. My dad is from Libya. My family is in Libya, and Supreme Court was wrong. And Trump is wrong, and I think that our policies are anti-humanitarian and immoral. The travel ban is a Muslim ban. It's a racist policy. It was enacted with animus towards Muslims and with discriminatory intent. And it is an effort to separate and demonize and dehumanize brown people from other parts of the world who need our help and who often need our help because of situations that we've created. Trump ran on a platform of racism and bigotry. These are things that the right has supported for years, and they have their man, and he's doing what he said he would do. And I think they are connected in that it is, and we see this with Jeff Sessions, he is living his dream. He is finally getting to enact policies that actively harm, hurt, and kill black and brown people. And the Muslim ban is one of those policies. Family separation is another.
This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
Mi nombre es Berta Arroyo. Soy mexicana.
My name is Berta Arroyo. I'm from Mexico, and I'm here in D.C. supporting the families that have been separated by these horrific immigration laws.
Mi letrero ha sido hecho por mi hija de 5 años y dice que no queremos.
My sign was made by my 5-year-old daughter. It says, "We don't want to see families separated, and we don't want ICE to continue terrorizing our families, Latinos or anyone from across the world. It's unfair and inhuman. Our families are terrorized, and the way the families and the children are suffering is totally unnecessary, and we want this to stop."
Para ellas y para los niños es totalmente innecesario y queremos que esto termine. Donald Trump, eres el peor presidente que la historia ha visto de los Estados Unidos.
Donald Trump, you are the worst president in U.S. history. We don't want you here in D.C.
El día en que te vayas, porque todo lo que has hecho es aterrorizante para mis hermanos.
I live here and I'm dreaming of seeing your exit because all you have done is terrorize our Mexican, Muslim brothers and our brothers from all countries.
Special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Carla Wills, John Hamilton, and Chris Belcher. This is Democracy Now! Here in New York, over 10,000 people marched across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Foley Square in New York City, and we're here to march across the Brooklyn Bridge, to march for immigrants, and to march for families that have been separated or brought back together. I'm here because New York City is a city of immigrants. Part of the reason the city is so great is because of immigrants and immigrant energy. And my family has been in this country for many generations, but I know that I walk around New York, and there are immigrants in fear. There are immigrants who've had their families separated. So I want immigration policies that are not based on hate.
Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here. Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here.
My name is Christina Cartagena. I'm born and raised here in Queens, New York. I have immigrant parents. I brought my family here because since we were born here, we have a privilege and a right to stand up for those people who weren't and who deserve asylum here and who are fleeing from circumstances that we can't even imagine, and they deserve to be here.
Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
My name's Adrian Winter, and I'm marching across the bridge today with my daughter because I think for the majority of my life, I've seen the country moving forward in a good direction, and now I see it turning backwards. When we were talking to her this morning and telling her where we were going, we were just saying that there are people taking their parents away from their children, and we don't like that, and it's bad, and it's wrong, and we're here to say that it's not a good thing to do. And we keep it in simple terms, and she understands it. She understands what it's like when she loses track of us for a couple minutes.
Revolt! 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 Resistance is not enough! Revolt! Revolt! Revolt!
We're sending a message today to Donald Trump that we will not stand while he is torturing and terrorizing our children. We are fighting the zero tolerance policy of this administration. We want these children to be reunited with their families.
My name is Reverend Marie A. Tatro, and I am a priest in the Episcopal Church. My job is to protect and serve God's people who are most vulnerable and who are most at risk. And so this movement is essential and it's core to our theology as a church. Never again means never again. We've been down this road before. The seeds of fascism are being planted, and we need to learn from our history. We need to learn from our mistakes and point out the evil and the sin where it is. And I'm hopeful that people in our country will rise up before it gets to that stage.
Thanks to Charina Nadura and Nat Needham. When we come back, we go to ground zero for zero tolerance to the U.S.-Mexico border. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We just returned from the U.S.-Mexico border, where we went to Brownsville and nearby McAllen, Texas, ground zero for zero tolerance. We went to a community meeting and afterwards spoke with one of the lawyers who had spoken at the meeting. He has been monitoring the mass trials and interviewing parents at the courthouse there who've been separated from their children. The U.S. government has separated more than 2,000 migrant children from their parents. Attorney Efren Oliveras is director of the Racial and Economic Justice Program for the Texas Civil Rights Project. I asked him to describe the impact of Trump's zero tolerance.
It's a humanitarian crisis. There's no other way to describe it. We have had now hundreds, over 2,000 families separated, and now we're getting to confirm that many of these parents are being deported without their children. The government has started to plant this narrative that a lot of the parents choose to live without their children, and I'm concerned that that is because in a couple of weeks we will be able to confirm that hundreds of parents have been deported without their children. We interviewed here in McAllen 381 parents, only one of them, and it was an aunt traveling with a nephew, and she told me, if I get deported, my nephew should stay behind because his mom lives here. Other than her, every single one of the people we interviewed said, if I get deported, I want my child to come with me.
And how many do you know, how many children have been deported with their parents?
I know 2 children have been deported without the parent they were separated from, and 5 parents have been deported and their children are still in the United States.
What happens when a child is deported alone back to their country?
They are turned over to the equivalent of ORR in their home country. And then it's up to that agency to determine what is in the best interest of the child. I imagine it's similar to the United States.
ORR being the
Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is in charge of taking custody of unaccompanied minors. And then the counterpart in Mexico or the Central American countries would have to determine what's in the best interest of the child, deliver them to a relative or something like that.
The government, the Trump administration, says that they have reunited 500 children with their parents. Do you know where this number is coming from? Do you believe them?
I don't believe they have been reunited, and here's why. Because that fact sheet that they released late on Saturday night is ambiguous as to whether that includes children turned over, released to a relative in the United States, or reunited with their parents. They have admitted, the Secretary of Health and Human Services confirmed that it will be very difficult to reunite children with parents if the parent is in detention. So that leads me to believe that those 522 children, I hope they are with their parents, but I think it's very likely that the vast majority of them have been released to a relative, not the parent they were separated from.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristen Nielsen said that the kids can, Skype with, talk on the phone to their parents easily. Is this true?
One of our clients has been detained for 2 weeks, has not spoken to her son once. And we know from interviews with her. Another one has had one phone call with her 6-year-old since she was separated on June 5th. And now we're starting to be able to find these parents and get them immigration attorneys who can meet with them. And we're confirming one of our clients who is detained outside of Texas has not been able to talk to his son who is at a shelter in Texas. for over a month now. I understand that the government is telling us that the children are at shelters and that there's a number, but I'm concerned if that information is getting to the parents. They are the ones who need that information to communicate with their children.
When the children are taken away from their parents, how does the government keep track of who is connected to who? I just came here from New York, and when they took my bag at the airport, at the gate, they give me a receipt. This is for a ripped up old rolly bag. What happens with the child?
We don't know. That's the problem. The government has not specified if they are keeping track of who the child belongs to, who's the parent, who's the child. I hope they have a better system. The information we have gleaned here in McAllen is that the Border Patrol agents take a family picture, a picture of the family unit, they call it. So a picture of the child and the parent to then keep track of who belongs with who. If that is the system, it's full of problems. It's highly fallible. Forget the problems with cross-racial identification. Just forget about that. Just taking a picture of a 5-year-old and then trying to match him or her with his mom, it's going to be a disaster. And then how is that, I imagine if that is the case, that's entered into the file of the parent and the child. And then how do you then go to a shelter with 200, 500, 1,000 children and find the one in the picture? I hope they have a better system.
What happened when President Trump signed the executive order saying they were no longer going to separate children from their parents?
So what
changed?
That happened on a Wednesday afternoon. We went to court the next day to interview to see if there were any parents who had been separated from their children. Now, that was over 12 hours after the executive order had been signed. We get to court that morning, and when the question is asked of the group, how many of you were traveling with children and were separated from them, 17 people stood up, all handcuffed, shackled around their ankles, and chains around their waist. And we were notified first thing in the morning that those 17 parents were not going to be prosecuted. They said their cases were dismissed. The prosecution chose not to file criminal charges against them. That was the immediate result of the executive order. Very confusing. So why were they brought to court if they're not going to be prosecuted?
So then where are their kids?
So they were sent back, and the government said on Saturday night that 16 of them were reunited with their children, or 16 children were reunited with their parents on June 22nd. As best we can tell, it was them. The 17 from Thursday morning were reunited with their children on Friday, or the vast majority of them. There's a discrepancy there with the numbers, but we're trying to look into that.
So, Efren, can you talk about what's going to happen now that the San Diego judge has ruled, a federal judge has ruled, that all of these children must be reunited with their parents within the next 30 days, and if they're younger than, 5 years old, they must be reunited within 14 days. How is this going to happen?
I was very relieved when I got the news of that injunction this morning, because what started happening this week, we keep track of these parents and what detention facility they're at, the 381 that we've interviewed. And we had a few of them that had been at a detention facility here in South Texas for days, for over a week, and then they were no longer in the system. What that means is that they are either deported or released to a family member, the parent. And then we were able to confirm that one of them had been deported. So that's when it hit me that they are deporting them faster than we can find immigration attorneys to represent them. So we started moving very quickly to try to find attorneys to represent the 167 here in South Texas.
When you say 167, parents or children?
Parents in South Texas. And luckily, that injunction prohibits the government from deporting parents without their children, because that's the most concern. What we hope is that everyone gets a fair shake, an attorney for their immigration case. If it turns out that they don't qualify for asylum, then so be it, but at least they should be deported with their child, not without their child. So that was the urgent thing. Now that the judge in California has issued this nationwide injunction, separations are going to stop. Deportations of parents without children should stop. And now the reunification is the biggest question, because the government wants to keep detaining families. the easiest way to reunite a child with his or her parent is to release them. Give them a court date. There was a family case management program that had 99.6% rate of compliance. People show up to their court hearings. If you provide them the guidance and the orientation, they will come to court for their hearings. Now, the Trump administration ended that program because they opted for caging children instead.
Explain what you mean by caging children.
Literally putting children in detention facilities where they are separated by age groups with hurricane fence cages. There's no other way to describe it.
Efren, can you describe what you do each day in court here in McAllen, Texas?
We interview the parents who have been separated from their children. We get their information, their names, dates of birth, country of origin, so that we can then track them in the system, try to locate the parents and the children, and try to reunite.
Can you describe the scene of the courtroom?
70 or 80 people are brought in handcuffs and shackles. So they walk in. I was talking about the racial element. It's very visual. They all are brown-skinned, and not everyone in the courtroom is brown-skinned. So the racial component is very visual. And then we meet with the ones who had children taken from them. And
they shackled?
Yes, they're shackled. I give them my business card. When they sign the documents, the interview documents, they struggle because they're handcuffed.
Are these criminals?
Not in my view. They're accused of the misdemeanor of illegal entry, and they are all sentenced to time served. They don't even get a sentence. They're sentenced to time served, meaning the 3 days that they have been in detention, that's their sentence. So when they exit the courtroom, they have completed their criminal sentence, and then they're turned over to immigration detention.
What's your final message for people to understand about what's happening here in Texas and along the border in the United States?
It's a humanitarian crisis, and if you have children, think about your 5-year-old, your 6-year-old, when you don't see them for a few days. Or think back to when you were a child, when you were 5, 6, 7, what it was like to not be with your parents, to go to sleep without your parents. We've had many moms tell us that they took away their daughter, but she was crying so much at night that they had to bring her back so that mom could console her and put her to sleep, and then they would take them away again.
Are parents being threatened with their children being adopted if they don't self-deport, if they don't say they'll be deported?
We've had at least 2 clients reach out through their relatives to us to report that they were told that if they wanted to see their children again, they had to sign their voluntary departure and renounce to their asylum claims.
Do the vast majority of people sign those voluntary departures to get their kids back?
We've had clients who have done that. If I were in that situation, if I was desperate to see my child, I would do anything I had to do to see my child.
Efren Oliveras, lawyer and director of the Racial and Economic Justice Program for the Texas Civil Rights Project. That does it for our show. Happy birthday to Isis Phillips. Democracy Now! Currently accepting applications for full-time news producer position. Check out democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.